Okay, everybody, this is me I'm going to start my first mini lecture, not mini lecture, for you guys. My studio is our bonus room above the garage. I have the TV up here. I'm not sure that's going to be any use to us. Books behind us and a bookshelf that makes it look a little scholarly. I got us a map over here. What you can't see right there is there's a bed. And over there, I don't want you to see that at all. Of course, that's where we're storing all of our hoard of toilet paper. So I have to keep that hidden from you all. Periodically, one of my two cats might come up here. You don't know. So if they break into the situation, that'll be at least interesting. I'm trying to figure out how this is all going to work out. When I was doing not that I do my hair, but when I was getting my hair ready, I was thinking to myself, what about haircuts? And what could happen, of course, is that by the end of this semester, I'd have a ponytail. I've always wanted to have a ponytail. I thought at least a cool thing. I have to tell you that my daughter gave her husband, my son-in-law, a haircut. And now he looks something like a concentration camp survivor, so I hope that their marriage will survive that. Anyway, but here we go. Let's try to do some of this history if we possibly can. This is going to be the final little section in terms of the Becoming Americans. The weirdest part about it is I did begin this part too, of course, but then you went to the old tapes, and so I have to kind of pick it up for myself. Remember that the most important thing that happened in colonial America is the transformation of people. Old world people came to the new world, impacted by the environment, impacted by the social mix, impacted by the cultural mix, impacted by the different economic activities, and the variety of things that are going on are transformed by that, and they ultimately, of course, became Americans. And I tried to give you a sense of the demographic developments. You have this extraordinarily rapidly growing population based upon a high rate of natural increase, and also immigration taking place at that time, of course. We have social structures that are beginning to develop that are uniquely American. The wealth distribution is much more benign than it was in terms of Europe or any place else around the entire world, of course. Less distinction between wealth and poverty. The class occupational structure basically just shows us that it was a people of middle-class farmers. 80% of the Americans in colonial America were middle-class farmers. And then I finally wanted to suggest, of course, that it's this deferential society, a society where it is elite-dominated, no doubt about that, but where the elites are gentle in terms of their domination because of the deferential concept. That the people deferred to them, voluntarily gave them authority, but of course, would not continue to voluntarily give that authority if the people were abusive. So you get a very relatively benign social structural apparatus. The economy was super strong in colonial America, fastest growing economy in the entire world, highest per capita income, pretty remarkable situation based upon the population growth, strong export trade in agriculture commodities, but also this deep involvement in overseas trade exemplified by the Navigation Acts. The political culture was manifesting, of course, in terms of the fact that the Americans were uniquely interested in the importance of liberty as a central concept. Their chief fear was power. Their desire was to preserve liberty, of course, and to limit power as much as they possibly could. And thus they turned to representative government as the essential government under which they would function. But so they had their own unique political culture, which of course was both robust and also the foundations of our modern American political culture. And then finally, of course, I wanted to suggest to you the cultural expressions of America through their educational apparatus, which, although there was no structure, did allow for a very high rate of literacy for men and even for women. And of course, the colleges that were created, the fact that the colonists, of course, had artistic expressions of one way or the other, literary expressions, musical expressions. And then finally, I wanted to kind of capstone all of this cultural expression with the importance of Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin, of course, is a potential identification. I'm going to be playing Bob Dylan here with holding up cards, which I hope will, at least in the beginning, this will be a way to kind of present the material. I told you Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706 to a poor but very large family. His father, Josiah Franklin, would have ultimately 17 children, fathered through 2 wives. Franklin was the 15th of 17, the 10th son, the 10th being the notion of that he was the tithing, that his father, a devout, soap maker and candlestick maker who spent almost his entire day just wallowing in tallow. It must have been an extremely greasy situation. Anyway, was a devoutly religious Puritan who hoped that Franklin would grow up to become a minister, giving your tithe, your tenth, the tithing to the church. Of course, not only was he not a minister, but he wasn't necessarily even a Christian, as he became a deist and associated with the Enlightenment as he increasingly matured. Anyway, Franklin was apprenticed, I told you, to be a printer. He will run away from Boston and the toxic relationship between himself and his brother James. He will go ultimately to Philadelphia, where he begin to fully develop his career, first as a printer, but also as a publisher, publishing two significant periodicals, including Poor Richard's Almanac, and Poor Richard's Almanac, just one of the most popular almanacs of the colonial period. It's simply, I can't remember how much I told you guys about this, but it's the word almanac is simply the Arab word for weather. And so in a day when there was no other way of prognostication for the weather, predicting the weather, what they did was simply have a historical record of the weather. Almanacs are historical records of the weather. For every single day, the average high, the average low, the amount of rainfall, first freeze, last freeze, snowfall, etc. All these are things that would be in an almanac. It was something that was essential for the average American farmer, so these almanacs were something that they would want to have in their possession if they possibly could. There were already almanacs in America, and Benjamin Franklin decided to kind of jump into this particular area, and he did so. He created Poor Richard's Almanac, and Poor Richard was a pseudonym. It was just a device that he could use. So it's Benjamin Franklin is the person expressing this. Poor Richard Saunders, a wise old farmer, but struggling most of the time, who simply had a lot to kind of say to people. And most of the almanac is just data, but all through it, it was spiced the little sayings of Poor Richard. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Guests and fish go bad after 3 days. These were all things that Franklin would have included in this. He also included sort of letters to the, well, not letters to the editor, but letters to of the lovelorn. He kind of did a Dear Abby situation where people would write in letters to him, of course, and then he actually would write the letters, and he would then respond to the letters, and of course make them as humorous and fun as he possibly could. Now, he came into a very competitive field, and so he had to try to make a name for his almanac, but one of the things he did that just sort of shows the genius of Benjamin Franklin was that in the initial edition of Poor Richard's Almanac, he published an obituary for the editor of the most prominent and popular of all the almanacs in America at that particular time. And of course, the guy was still alive, and it was just a joke that he played upon it. And I think the guy sued him, but it's not necessarily libelous to, and the obituary was very nice, but libelous to proclaim someone else being actually dead. And in the second edition of the almanac, they'd be published annually. He then said that he was continually being haunted by this particular individual. Anyway, but Poor Richard's Almanac was the foundation of sort of the wealth that Franklin would ultimately generate. Much more important, though, ultimately was the Pennsylvania Gazette. Pennsylvania Gazette became the most popular newspaper in America in the colonial period. There weren't really newspapers, they were simply broadsheets. The technology was not available to be able to publish anything on a daily basis. So this would come out maybe twice a week, I think once a week generally. They were just done, well, in terms of being a newspaper, it was all done by hand, of course, hand assembly of all the type print. They would place a big broadsheet down on the printing press, which actually was a press, of course. They would print one side of the piece of paper, they would hang it up, let it dry, they would then turn it over, print the other side of the piece of paper, and then let that dry, and when you had it, you'd fold it over, so page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. Anyway, this was the broad sheets that they would have at this time. And the Pennsylvania Gazette was absolutely the most popular in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, but also popular through the entire colonies. And what it did was it allowed Benjamin Franklin, and here's my cat hanging out in front of us, allowed Benjamin Franklin to do other things, really. He always kept his connection to his printing press, he always kept his connection to his newspapers and periodicals, but he decided ultimately, this would be like in the 1740s, to begin to move on to do other things, creating the very eclectic life that he will have. One of the things about Benjamin Franklin was that he understood kind of the dynamics of life at that time, and that life expectancy was like in the high 30s. So when he reached that age, he just thought, he's going to die relatively quickly, so he thought he would do a variety of other things. So he began to create a career in a variety of activities that have become, he's famous for. He was a significant inventor of note. And I would ask you now if any of you know what was invented by Benjamin Franklin, but I know that that's not going to go over very well. So let's just pretend that oh yes, that's right. He invented the bifocals. He was simply the first person that he had outdoor glasses, he had reading glasses, and you could just cut the lenses, of course, put the two of them together and make the bifocal, which of course will become very useful for many people around the world. He also was the inventor of the lightning rod. The lightning rod was a way to attract lightning, to keep it from being as destructive on buildings and ships, and the first lightning rods in the entire world will appear first in Philadelphia on both buildings and the ships coming out of that particular port. The downtown area of Philadelphia is kind of cool. It's a historical area, so many of the old buildings are still there. And I was walking down a cobblestone street one day, and I remember by church, and you could just see this wrought iron piece of metal that came right down the side of the steeple, and I'm sure it was, you know, one of these very early lightning rods, which was designed to protect the building. He was also famous for creating the Franklin stove. The Franklin stove was simply a way of increasing the relative heat of indoor heating for a building at that time. My cat's right here, and I'm petting it. Anyway, the big fireplaces would sometimes just suck the heat out of the room, and he put the fire in a metal box, and I think that's like the most important component of the whole thing. It had a design where the smoke was supposed to rise, go down, and then go up, but the heat was radiating, would radiate around the room. And although his stove never quite worked perfectly, the concept of what would emerge as the pot-bellied stove is coming out of the Franklin stove. So that becomes something very important. All right. Anyway, Jojo, get down. Okay, so he also invented something called, I think it's harmonium. So it's based on that notion of, you know, you wet your finger and you go on a crystal glass and you can make a really cool sound with it. So he had an axis that had a bunch of glass discs on it, and the glass discs would, you could turn them with a crank and they would dip down into a little bit of water, and you could move your finger or fingers from one of the glass discs to another, creating just a really, really cool sound. I'm not sure who this was, if it was Mozart or somebody, you know, one of the musical figures of that time, but they actually did some little, you know, concerto to the harmonium. So that became something that he also contributed. Franklin also became an extraordinarily important scientist of note. In fact, he is, you know, very famous in terms of his scientific activities. You know, if I would ask you, if I could, you know, what his great scientific area was, and maybe some of you might know before I tell you. What I can do. Anyway, he's not, of course, not the inventor of electricity. No one's going to be the inventor of electricity. Ow! Ooh, get down. Jojo, what do you want? Oh. Okay. Not the inventor of electricity. Sorry about that. My cat just loved me so much. What can I say? Anyway, but he is, I'd say, the discoverer of electricity. So in the same sense of Vespucci, the discoverer, the first to understand and articulate as far as electricity is concerned. He will write in the year 1751 the first significant scientific treatise on electricity. The book is entitled Experiments and Observations. It's supposed to be and, sorry about that, and Observations in Electricity. This was published in 1751. The book is the first to really kind of denote the characteristics of electricity. From this book will come certain concepts that, you know, I'm sure you guys have heard of. Benjamin Franklin was the first to identify the negative and positive charges of electricity. So whenever you see a plus or a minus on a battery, that's coming from Franklin. And by the way, the word battery is from Benjamin Franklin. He created these little storage devices, glass tubes, where he felt he could store the electricity. And he called them a battery because he had a whole bunch of them, and it seemed like he thought the electricity kind of exploded out of them in the way that a cannon would explode out of a battery. But for this work, he will be honored not only, of course, in America, but in Great Britain and France, given a membership to the Royal Academy of Sciences. This is something created by Edmund Halley, which was designed to promote, of course, science, scientific discovery, and scientific activity around the world. The members can only be those people who have made an original contribution to the field, and Benjamin Franklin is recognized, of course, as making the extraordinary original contribution in terms of electricity. And the Europeans would routinely consider him to be, you know, call him Dr. Franklin because of his important scientific contributions. I do want to mention at least one of the most famous of the experiments. I'm sure you guys have at least heard of this particular experiment that he conducted. Now, we don't think he actually conducted it because of the extraordinary danger of it, but it was this famous story of flying the kite into a thunderstorm with a little lightning rod on the very top of the kite, with the intention, of course, of attracting a lightning bolt to it, and of course electricity flowing down the cord of the kite, string of the kite down to illuminate a key that would be suspended in a jar. We don't think he did this because if he had done it, it could have very well killed him. And so we think it was more a thought experience than a real thing. But the tragedy of the story is that there were a number of people who decided that they would emulate that experiment, and at least 5 of them were killed doing that. So not necessarily the smartest thing for someone to do. He also did create the world's first generator. So he created a generator of electricity, which he, of course, would use to one degree kind of to amuse himself and others, by shocking people. He did try to electrocute a turkey, try to kill it, and I think it knocked him out. So he almost got himself killed by his activities in terms of electricity. But anyway, of course, this is one more very important thing that Franklin will do. In the end, of course, he's most famous in America for being a diplomat and a statesman. He was America's first ambassador plenipotentiary, meaning that he was the ambassador of the United States of America when there were no others. He'd be critical, of course, in establishing relations with France, including creating the foundation for the French alliance during the American Revolution. He was a statesman in the sense that he was a writer and signer of the Declaration of Independence, a writer and signer, of course, of the Constitution of the United States. It's almost like every time there was something critically important in America, then Benjamin Franklin was there. And in the end, here's my significance for Benjamin Franklin. There's a book written about him that describes him as the first American. And I do believe that is, that it's really telling of the reality of Benjamin Franklin, just the amazing importance that he has. But one thing about him that I find interesting, he lived for 20 years in Europe. And I have to tell you that when I first heard that, I was a little bit offended. I thought, oh my, here's this guy spending all this time in Europe. And he loved Europe. He loved London. He loved Paris. I was walking down the street in London one day and I saw a sign that said Benjamin Franklin lived here. So, the guy was clearly, that was part of his world. Anyway, but by being in Europe, by being in Great Britain especially, he began to realize that the Americans weren't British. They weren't like the Europeans in any kind of way. So it's kind of seems to be the case that he was the first person to realize the distinctness of the American people, and thus we could give him the honor, and I think it's absolutely correct. He was the most famous American in colonial America by far, of being the first American, and I think that nothing else, it's a very cool thing to be. And what Franklin was realizing, of course, is that because of all these developments associated with becoming Americans, demographic, social, economic, political, and cultural, what that meant was, of course, that the Americans were becoming this distinct people. And Benjamin Franklin, of course, realized that distinction and ultimately decided that, the thing to do, of course, is that Americans should leave. And so we begin to leave this notion of becoming Americans, because one of the outcomes of becoming Americans is to creating a distinct people. And if you create a distinct people, then of course you get the foundations for a new nation. So the story goes from becoming Americans to increasingly breaking with Great Britain. And I hope you guys brought your tissues and hankies, because breaking with Great Britain, as you can imagine, it's not going to be sad. The Americans are going to come out great as far as it's concerned, but that's the topic we'll turn to next, okay? So chop this off to create this as upload, and then I'll get back to you soon.